Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizer for their welcoming here in that beautiful city. Also, sorry for Julian, who already heard a bit of this talk a couple of weeks ago, so sorry. The topic of this talk is the theory of intentionality as it is developed from a semiotic standpoint by Husserl in the logical investigation. The main goal of the talk will be to provide you with a reconstruction of Husserlian intentionality that is compatible with the framework of multi-cognition, or at least some of the E's of the multi-cognition framework. And that provides as well a support for a non-representationalist account of the semiotic-based cognitive processes. To achieve these goals, the method will be the following. I will develop a systematic analysis of the structure of semiotic intentionality, understood here as a meaning and cognizing relationship that links a signifier to something that is signified. So that's for the bold picture of the talk. Now we can move on to the introductive part of the talk. So at the background of the talk, there are like three big figures. The first one is that of Franz Brentano, who famously claimed that every mental phenomenon is characterized by the intentional inexistence of an object, that is, by the reference to a content, the direction toward an object, or immanent objectivity. The second one is that of Twardowski, who introduced a kind of distinction in what is intended in intentional act, when he claimed that what is presented in a presentation is its content, whereas what is presented through a presentation is its object. And the third one is that of Husserl himself, which on the basis of the Twardowskian distinction conceived intentionality not as an ordinary relation to an extraordinary object, as it is the case in the Brentanian framework, but as a special kind of relation to an ordinary object. Yeah, all these three big figures share a common basic take on intentionality, understood as a meaning and cognizing process that constitutes the power of mind to be about something, that is, to direct itself towards something as significant, and that possibly on the basis of a signifier. So against that background, the idea of semiotic intentionality is to somehow recast a binary model of semiotic meaning, according to which a signifier is articulated to something that is signified, via intentionality, understood as the act that links the consciousness to an object via a content. So you can notice here that these three structural components, act, object, content, are due to Twardowski. That's what I mentioned just a couple of slides ago. So that can be presented in the following table. You have it in the handout. So you have here the signifier and the signified, and as you see, the signified itself is divided into three different components. So the act, the content, and the object. These three components can be defined as follows. So the act is the concrete subjective intimation of meaning, the content is the abstract objective correlate of meaning, and the object itself is the object meant reference. So when you take this table from a kind of dynamic viewpoint, you start with a signifier. You're able then to target some object via intending acts. This object fulfills your intentional acts via fulfilling acts. When the intending acts are processed by an act of abstraction, what you get is the intentional content. The same goes for the fulfilling side of the picture. And when these two types of content, the intentional and the fulfillment contents, are taken at a categorical level, they contribute to the stabilization of the whole picture. So that's what we will go through in this talk, the elaboration of this semiotic intentionality process. You have it in it's the first figure of in the handout, and I would recommend to try to follow the talk on basis of these two tables, the first figure and the first table. That will make things a bit easier, because the talk is a bit abstract. So last note regarding the outreach of that table in the model that I just presented. It is meant to be applicable to any meaning and cognition that involves one of our five senses. And as such, its scope is that of every semiotic system that is used as such, both linguistic and non-linguistic, be it spoken, written, formal, natural, etc. You have some example in the first example in the handout. So in this talk, I will mainly focus on the act and the content, not deal that much with the reference aspect of that table. And on that basis, I'm now presenting the outline of the talk. So we will deal with the structure of intentionality. First, we will be concerned with concrete intentionality. There we will be dealing with intentional acts. Then we'll move on that basis to the abstract level of intentionality. In that case, we will be concerned with the intentional content. And at the last step, at the last stage of the outline, we will reach the categorical level. Just a warning before we go on into the talk. My purpose here is that of a systematic analysis and reconstruction of Husserlian semiotic intentionality, and that purpose is not kind of philological or exegetical work. And with this purpose in mind, I will endorse to a certain extent a kind of metaphysical neutrality with respect to some ontological issues that may come up during the talk. So that's just for the warning. So now we can move on to the first section of the talk, so the concrete intentionality. Here, intentionality is considered as a real relationship that is both concrete and subjective. So that's the reason why I'm calling this first section concrete intentionality. And this relation articulates three actual components. The three components are the semiotizing act, the meaning intending act, and the meaning fulfilling act. So let's start with the semiotizing act. Sorry for that, I don't know. So in that case, we will be concerned with the object that becomes a sign. We'll consider that object as a concrete real phenomenon, and we will try to focus on precisely the constitution as signifier, how this kind of object acquire meanings, get meaningful. So the situation is the following. We have one and the same object, and that object is successively endowed with two different meaning functions. First, the sign is perceived as an object. It is the target of an intuitive intention, and then it becomes operating. When it becomes operating as a signifier, it is then the source of an intention. So you have in the handout the example of the arabesque, but we will go back to that at the end of the second section of the talk. So that transition that is conceived by Husserl in terms of a transition from the intuitive mode to the signitive mode of intentionality, given that signitive mode of intentionality can be defined as the act of using an object as a sign to express a meaning and eventually intend an object, that very transition is performed by the intentional consciousness itself, which activates the potential meaning function of a sign. And as a consequence, we got that the object sign itself is now constituted as a meaning vehicle. So the conclusion of this first section is the following. The status of the signifier proceeds from the concrete intentionalization, which is, like I just said, arbitrarily performed by the intentional consciousness, and that intentionalization has two sides. The first of these two sides is that of the meaning intending act. So in that case, we'll be dealing with meaning understood as meaning giving act or act of giving meaning, and we'll focus on the existence of such acts, the existence of such meaning in acts. Their existence is, so to say, guided by two principles, the first of which is that of directedness, which consists in saying that the meaning acts are exclusively directed on their intended object. As such, the role of a meaning here is that as working of as an access provider to the intended object as it is meant. So that's for the first principle. The second of these two principles is that of relationalism, and it consists in saying that meaning here is only a linking process. It only consists in linking a sign to some designated object. And as such, the status of meaning here is that of kind of pure transitivity. There's nothing that abstracts meaning as bearer of intentionality. So what we have here as an outcome is a kind of quite clear, strong rejection of the classic semiotic triangle, according to which a sign is related to an object via some sense that can be hypostasized. So you can think of the Frege picture, for example. The second component of the concrete intentionalization process is that of the meaning fulfilling act. In this case, we'll start with the referential meaning process, and we'll focus on two alternative possibilities that this process faces. And these two alternative possibilities will provide us with two different senses of intentionality itself that will help us to understand how the meaning fulfilling acts are constituted. So the first sense is the narrow sense of intentionality. In this case, we are dealing with an empty or an unfilled intention, and intentionality is a kind of irrelative concept, meaning here that the targeted object is meant without being given. The reference is not realized. The second sense of intentionality is a wider sense, and in that case, we are dealing with complete or filled intention. Intentionality is here a relative concept, meaning here that the targeted object is meant and given. The reference is realized. So as a conclusion of this third subsection of the first section of the talk, we've got that the meaning fulfilling act clearly belongs to the wider sense of intentionality. And with this respect, in the Husserlian framework, their operativeness is somehow supererogatory in the sense that they are just here, as Husserl coins it, to confirm, to reinforce, to illustrate the narrow sense of intentionality. So to conclude this first section, what remains to be said is that these three actual components of the semiotic referential meaning process constitute the primary mode of being of intentionality, and as such, they provide us with the subjective basis for unifying meaning into objective ideal unities. So in the logical investigation, what is at stake here is a kind of combination between the philosophy of act of Brentano and the philosophy of content of the philosophy of sense of Brentano via a reinterpretation of the Platonic theories of ideas that is due to Lotze. So that's somehow what is at stake in the logical in the semantics aspect of the logical investigation themselves. So now we can move on to the abstract intentionality. In that case, intentionality is an ideal relation that is both abstract and objective. That's the reason why calling this section abstract intentionality. And that relation articulates three contextual components. These components are the semiotized content, the meaning intending content, and the meaning fulfillment content. So again, I will deal here successively with these three components. So let's start with the semiotized content. In this case, we start with signifiers considered as meaningful in virtue of their concrete intentionalization, and we'll try to understand how they are constituted as semiotic, that is, intentional tools. So as input, we've got sign considered as token. Here, the object is a phenomenon. Its status is that of being a differential instance of a concrete meaning function. We process this input by identifying them as token of some type, that is by recognizing the meaning function as at least self-identical. As an output, what we get is the sign considered as a type. Here it is non-phenomenal. The status of such a sign is to be the identical correlate of an abstract meaning function. So what we got here as an outcome of this first subsection of the second section of the talk is that the role of the signifiers proceeds from the abstract intentionalization. meaning here that the meaning function is somehow assimilated into abstract meaning. And again, as it was the case for the concrete intentionality, this process of intentionalization has two sides. The first of these two sides is that of meaning intentional content. In that case, we are dealing with meaning considered as abstract ideal units, and we'll focus on trying to understand how they are obtained, namely by reflection on concrete acts. So the input in this case is that of an indefinite pluralities of meaning-giving acts. We process these pluralities via a twofold act of abstraction on them. And as an output of this twofold act of abstraction, we have two types of meaning-intentional contents in the framework of the logical investigation. The first of these two types is that of meaning species, meaning here that they consist in the structural, specific invariant of meaning-giving acts. And we perform the secondary act of abstraction on this very species. What we get is what Husserl calls the idealities, meaning here the unified idealities of act species of meaning intention. So the abstract units of meaning, against that background, will consist in will be operative as equivalent classes, and when these equivalent classes will be processed by what Husserl calls formalizing abstraction, they will operate as categorizing all meaning-giving acts, with here kind of looping effect at stake. So on the side of the meaning fulfillment content, the story is the same. So we are here focused on the fulfillment considered as abstract ideal units. We'll try to understand how they are obtained by reflection on concrete acts. The only difference is that the constraint is here that we will be only dealing with the case of complete or field intentions. So in that case, the input consists in indefinite pluralities of meaning fulfilling acts. We process them via a twofold act of abstraction, and what we get is two different types of meaning fulfillment content. The first of which is fulfillment species, or structural specific invariant of meaning fulfilling acts. And when we perform a secondary act of abstraction on this very species, we get what Husserl calls the idealities, which consist in the unified idealities act species of fulfillment. And the story is again the same for the conclusion. So the abstract units of fulfillment are operative as equivalent classes of acts, and when they are processed by a third mode of abstraction that we will go into in the last section of the talk, they will operate as categorizing every meaning fulfilling act. Again, the same looping effect as we saw earlier. So to conclude this section, on what remains to be said about the three contextual components of the semiotic referential meaning process is that they constitute the secondary mode of being of intentionality, and as such, they provide us with the objective basis to compose or that compose the categorical intentionality. Before we go on to the last part of the talk, the arabesque example. I take it because you find it in Husserl since the early years of his work, namely in '94. And it's quite easy, or at least in the Husserlian framework, to decompose its successive intentional steps. So we are dealing here with 4 intentional steps. The first consists in the deciphering of the arabesque itself, and when you decipher it, you turn it as an object into a meaningful sign, so that's the semiotization step. Then when you read it, you are aiming at some intended reference as meant, that's a meaning-intending act. And when you recite it, for example, you are able to perform an abstraction on this meaning-intending act, and thereby producing the abstract content of meaning. And when you take this content at a formal level, so to say, or to say in the Husserlian parlance, you are able to analyze the very structure of meaning. For example, you are able to be sensitive to the concentric symmetry that is at stake in the throne verse of the Quran, which is which that arabesque represents. You have the categorical aspect a bit spelled out in the definition that you have in the handout if you want to discuss this at the end of the talk. So now move on to the last part of the talk on categorical intentionality. In this case, we'll be dealing with successively three components: the categorical forms, the categorical domains, and the categorical morphologies. And these three components, all these three components will be twofold in the sense that they proceed from intentionality. So to be a bit more precise on this aspect, so you have intentionality that is somehow split in two sides: the meaning intention, the meaning fulfillment. That gives rise to the categorical forms of object and meaning respectively, and these categorical forms belong to the categorical domains, apophantic and ontological respectively, and these two categorical domains are themselves nomologically regulated by the categorical morphologies, which are known as the pure logical grammar and the theory of wholes and parts, so the third and the fourth investigation. Husserl's investigation. Just a quick note on the very notion of morphology. Here I only mean the theory of forms. Okay, in that case, the categorical forms. So let's start with the categorical form. The categorical form are obtained via process of abstraction, as we already seen it in the second section of the talk, which consists in grasping, so to say, the universal as an objective unit. In the case of categorical form, the process of abstraction is threefold. So the first process is the first mode of abstraction here is that of what was also called generalizing abstraction, which produces what was also called the species or genera. In that case, the inputs are first order objects like concrete things or acts. The process consists in focusing on their similarities, extracting commonalities, and the output is what Husserl calls the empirical or material essences. The second mode of abstraction is that of idealizing abstraction, and that produces the idealities, as we have already seen in the second section of the talk. So in that case, the input is consists in second order objects, such as species and genera. We process them by an asymptotic progress toward a limit, which is neither realized nor realizable by any member of the group that is gathered together. And as an output, we obtain what Husserl called the ideal essences or the pure essences, which will work as the categorizing entities. And the last step in the threefold abstraction process is that of the formalizing abstraction that I just mentioned earlier. In that case, that will be what will produce the categorialities. So in that case, we are operating on higher order objects with respect to the categorizing power, namely on idealities. We process them by isolating their formal feature, and as an output, we get the mere empty categorical forms, as Husserl coined it. So we have here that the categorical forms are somehow the byproduct of threefold abstraction on meaning intending and meaning fulfilling acts. These categorical forms, like I already said, belongs to categorical domains which are nomologically regulated by the categorical morphologies. So the categorical morphologies, they are based on a distinction between simple and complex entities, categorical entities. The criteria for distinguishing between these two types of entities is that of the decomposability as whole into a plurality of articulated parts. And as such, the categorical morphologies in the Husserlian framework work as mereology, focusing on the composition of categorical complexes. So the component of the mereologies are the categorical entities themselves, like I already said. These entities are of two basic types. That distinction goes back to the medieval distinction between categorematic and syncategorematic terms. So on the one hand, we got the independent entities, which are not necessarily integrated into wholes, and on the other hand, the non-independent entities, which are necessarily integrated into wholes. With these entities, mereologies perform their work according to categorical laws of combination, which are layered on two levels. These two levels corresponds more or less to the distinction between the formation rule of a language and the transformation rule of a formal system. So at the lower level, we are dealing with the rule for the well formation of wholes by parts. So in the case of authentics, what is at stake here in the Husserlian framework is the distinction between the sense and the nonsense. On the upper level, we are dealing with the rule for the consistency of wholes with respect to decomposing parts. In the Husserlian framework, what is at stake here is the distinction between the sensical and the countersensical. So with respect to the nomologicality, the categorical morphologies operates as the transcendental regulator of the categorical domains, both apophantic and ontological. The categorical domain now, last section of the talk, subsection of the talk. So they are made of the two categorical forms, namely of meaning and of objects. And as such, they combine two correlated sides, which both operates as transcendental structure in the logical investigations. So on the apophantic side, what is at stake is the determination of the condition of possibility of any meaning fillability. The focus is here on the intention sources, and what is determined is its possibility to be meaningful and to be fulfilled successively in two steps. So the impact is here on meaning intention itself, and the intentionality, the whole framework of intentionality, is directly determined on the apophantic side. It corresponds to the narrow sense of intentionality. Whereas on the ontological side, what is determined is the condition of possibility of the object fulfilledness, so the focus is on the intention target, and what is determined is its possibility to be given to be fulfilling successively in two steps, like I said for the apophantic side. And so the impact is here on the meaning fulfillment side of the framework, of the intentional framework, and as such, intentionality is here indirectly determined. So that corresponds to the wider sense of intentionality. With respect to, and that's with respect to the transcendentality that the categorical domains operate as categorizing any intentional acts, both intending and fulfilling acts, and they provide as such a determination at a structural level of any possibility of fulfillment. So the fulfillment itself involves a threefold correspondence. At the very at the core level, the categorical level, this consists in a structural match between the two sides of the categorical domains. At the level of abstract intentionality, that consisted in the coincidence of the intentional and the fulfillment contents. And at the level of the concrete intentionality, that consists or that corresponds to like Gestalt calling it, a fusion of acts, namely intending and fulfilling acts. So what we got here with these three levels of fulfillment, operating as the concrete subjective, abstract objective, and transcendental categorical level, is a kind of full reconstruction of Husserlian semiotic intentionality, so to say, from its cornerstones to its keystone. So to conclude the talk, so the results of the talk is a kind of model, in a sense that I can spell out, of semiotic intentionality as a meaning and cognizing process. That model is compatible with the embodied and embedded extended cognition framework, in the sense that at the level of concrete intentionality, meaning is understood as a meaning-making process that is deeply rooted in situated bodily practices on external devices. This is a support for a non-representational stake on semiotic cognition, in the sense that at the level of abstract intentionality, cognition is understood as the process that, as processing the constitutive condition for the givenness of the world itself by the correlation of two types of non-natural and extrinsic intentional content, as opposed to the processing of internal reproduction of a pre-given world conveyed by physical structure endowed with natural intrinsic content. And as a bonus output, what we have got here is that is the consistent transcendentality of the semiotic model of intentionality, in the sense that at the categorical level, so that corresponds to the three sections that we have displayed in this talk, the transcendental immanent structure of intentional meaning and fulfillment that is displayed is meant to be the condition of possibility for the mind to be about something. So what remains to be done is a more accurate analysis of the process of abstraction. So the first section of the first subsection of the third section of the talk, and a more detailed understanding of the reference determination process, both being at stake at the categorical level of the intentional framework. But like they say, he only showed the way. So, thank you.